Galatians chapter 5, verses, excuse me, let me do that again. Galatians chapter 5, verse 7. You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? Now, again and again, we find Paul making references to sporting events. Here, of course, is the idea of marathon running. Paul is telling them that they were doing so well. What happened? Yet it's more than just what happened. He asked them who hindered them from obeying the truth. Now to continue with Paul's analogy a bit, it's interesting to think of these Galatians to be hindered in their belief of the truth. It's as if they were running the race and then someone came up and bound them with chains and forced them to carry heavy objects. I can just imagine like a sprinter in the Olympics. He's going down the backstretch, of the 100-yard dash or whatever, or the 1,500 meter, and then somebody drives up alongside with a motorcycle and gives them a bag full of books or something. Now this is exactly the picture we see in Lamentations 1:14. Which reads, "The yoke of my transgressions was bound. They were woven together by his hands and thrust upon my neck. He made my strength fail. The Lord delivered me into the hands of those whom I am not able to withstand." Yet we see that salvation, as has already been mentioned here, is a free gift, a gift of grace through faith. This all ties together nicely with Paul's metaphor about the yoke of bondage and the freedom of the gospel. So if you are of the gospel, you are free. You are unhindered. Chris?
Cool. Okay. Yeah, Paul definitely makes sports analogies all the time. Paul had to be like a sports fan. I wonder if like his pre-converted Paul was like always watching Sports Center or whatever. But he's making, as you mentioned, a analogy to Olympic running. And this word that hinder, when he says, "Who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth?" means kind of to beat back or to check. It's what would happen in a race if a person cut off or cut in front of another runner. And it's an action that was then and still today is illegal in a race. And this is what the false teachers had done essentially to the Galatians' progress. They did so that they would not obey the truth. So their motivation, according to Paul here, was very malicious. And I tend to think that false teachers at their core are either malicious or deceived demonically. The people that usually fall under them oftentimes are true believers, but the people who start it usually seem to be, they might be true believers, but they got it through some action, or they're just doing it knowingly. There's other exceptions, I suppose, to that, but we certainly see that with today's cults. But anyway, he says, "Ye did run well." This is probably him genuinely reminiscing about the strength of their start in this race. They were running well. It was probably hurtful to Paul and disappointing to hear the reports that they were now in such a mess. "Who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth?" Who, the question he rhetorically asks here, is Paul has in mind a specific false teacher. I'm sure that this guy was very charismatic, as false teachers often are. And, I tend to look at it like Satan picks people that he can use, that he sees that have these certain talents, maybe very convincing speakers or something like that. And in contrast, a lot of times, to God's sort of way of doing it, which is he picks people with heart and then sort of gives them on-the-job training. He doesn't really require them to have the talent. Like Moses is a good example. Moses wasn't a good speaker, but probably used as a great speaker. And that is all I have for this verse, Mike.
Well, it was still good. I mean, you had a lot. It was like a good addition,
A new addition.
Yeah. Galatians chapter 5, verse 8. This persuasion is not from him who calls you. Now, this persuasion Paul is writing about is likely the persuasion of God's Spirit drawing a person towards him to be reconciled if he is an unbeliever, and to be more and more Christ-like if he is a believer. The yoke of the law and the works-based righteousness is never from God. Let me say that again. The yoke of the law and works-based righteousness is never from God. We as believers would do well to remember that for a variety of reasons. One particularly interesting one is that you can lump all religions into one of two categories, the gospel of grace and the gospel of works. Since we can be sure from the above that the persuasion of works is not from God, we can actually use that to our advantage oftentimes in a host of settings, one of which is in apologetical conversations. People will tell you, well, okay, it's the gospel, but this other stuff here, and you can go, well, a little leaven leavens the whole lump, which is our next verse. You can see it in areas of discernment and a whole host of other places. We can be sure, as verse 8 says here, that this gospel of works, this persuasion, is not from him who calls you. Chris?
Cool. Okay, this persuasion cometh not from him that calls you. This is connected to the previous verse. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? Paul knows that the false teaching comes from a person who hindered you, but it didn't come from Jesus. This persuasion did not come from him who calls you. This is another quote from Missler, drawn a lot from him this study. He says, if you find yourself in a works trip, it's not of the Lord. He also says in that one, it's a lot of so busy in the service of the king that you have no time for the king. And that's all I have.
That's a great quote. We find ourselves so often so busy in service for the king, I do, that we have no time to sit before the king and just listen to what he has to say. That's the whole other end of this thing. You find yourself in various ministries and you're just so worked up and doing all this stuff. It's like when was the last time you sat down and just read the word and let it wash over you and just sort of emulsify areas that need to change and stuff?
Definitely.
Yep. Verse 9, Galatians chapter 5, verse 9. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Now, leaven is yeast. And what happens when you mix yeast into a lump of dough? ? It mixes into all of the dough, the whole lump. It leavens the whole lump. So Paul is making the point that even if you put yourself under a little bit of the law, you find that leaven leavens the whole batch. And this is the case with believers. Don't start mixing in the gospel of works, even a little bit, with the gospel of grace, because, as the verse says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Chris?
Leaveneth the whole lump. It's always bad in Scripture. It's used as a type of sin. Guzik quotes, a quote from Guzik says, Paul is saying that the legalistic commitment that they have right now might be small, but it is so dangerous that it can corrupt everything. And I think that's sort of the genius of legalism, especially that just is harping on a particular thing. This really stresses the importance of having good doctrine, because if you have 90% good doctrine but believe, for example, that you must speak in tongues or worship on Saturday to be circumcised in order to be saved, then those things will eventually become sort of the primary focus of your interest, and the error will become prominent. It will leaven the whole lump. And that such is the case with legalism. So how do you get good doctrine? Well, you pray is one thing. You study the Word is in primary importance. I think that listening to, verse by verse
study.
Verse by verse, not just ours, of course, but others. I like the idea of verse by verse because it does.
Ours, of course, being the best.
Declare the whole counsel of God, and other kinds of sermons too, of course. In fact, if you listen to a lot of sermons, you start to develop good doctrine. You can sort of see what is not. You might take a little bit out of something and recognize errors in others just because of the sheer amount. But you really let the Holy Spirit will instruct you as you listen to verse by verse BibleTeaching.com.